Here we go.
Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm going to try to actually. That's okay. 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 So here's Restorative Justice International. This is a PowerPoint that's been used around the world. In fact, we just did a presentation in India last week, and we presented in Bahrain and Brazil and other places. So the organization was founded by me in 2008, and this organization really grew out of other work that I had done nationally and in California. I had an organization called the Justice and Reconciliation Project, which was based in California. And but that organization was a national group, and it worked with crime victims largely. But this group really was very organic, as they say, and I created it through LinkedIn, which is how I met Obi. But it's pretty amazing. It came out of my relationships with people around the country and around the world. And there's the website, so you can go online and see more about us, as you know, in the future. So next slide. Oh, that's just a picture of me presenting in California. I think that's at a church. But let me just explain too that the organization is largely an advocacy organization. We focus on supporting systemic justice reform based on restorative justice. And our work allows us to network with others around the world, around the country here, to promote and educate people about restorative justice. We currently have 6,000 members, so they're members and affiliates, and our affiliate list is on our site. It's very broad. We work with whoever wants to work with us. We work with those who see the vision of restorative justice and its importance, that it is the basis for systemic justice reform. And but we take on other topics. It's like I said, the group was founded in 2008, and we have taken on issues where we think we need to be a strong voice, and that includes talking about alternatives to incarceration, taking on mass incarceration, and what does that look like in a system based on restorative justice? If you're saying we don't want mass incarceration, so what's the alternative? And we think it's restorative justice. We've been very active in the last year on COVID-19 in prisons. We think that's very important to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on our prisons and jails, both the United States and internationally. We've gotten involved, as Obi said, on wrongful convictions, actually the last 2 years, and largely it's been through Jeffrey Deskovic and the Deskovic Foundation. In fact, there's a podcast with Jeff on our website. He also is a member of our Global Advisory Council. Like I said, we get active also on promoting alternatives to incarceration. And lastly, we have a Global Advisory Council, and it includes 12 members from people from the United States and internationally. So there are actually 12 different countries, and Jeff is one of them. But it's it's got broad representation. We work with crime victims, but we also work with ex-offenders, and we work with like Jeff Deskovic, who's an exoneree, but we have human rights activists and also a lot of academics. But there's great interest in this work, and it's not just in the United States, it's around the world. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, is this the video?
Yeah, this is the video.
That's okay. Yeah, you can go ahead. Okay, let me just give it an intro here, and then hopefully it will play. But don't start it yet, Charlene. So this is a short video. I usually actually do another slide, but we'll just go with this. This is a short video on RJI, Restorative Justice International, and we tell the stories of 2 crime victims that support restorative justice. The video is on the front of our website if you have trouble viewing it. But this gives you a flavor of the work. It's pretty highly charged, so you have to just sit back and watch. It tells the stories of 2 crime victims who support restorative justice, one in California and one in North Carolina. Okay, Charlene, you want to?
Okay, let's this. Whoops. Give me just a second here. It looks like the video may have closed down. Huh.
Charlene, you may have to take it out of the presentation and just put it in a separate link to show it.
It totally closed the PowerPoint down.
Okay, can you reopen the PowerPoint?
It's opening. Let's see.
Okay, I'll just talk over you.
Okay.
Okay, so we've had this problem before, so my apologies. It's hard when you're using videos. But can you imagine presenting this PowerPoint in Brazil where it had to be translated into Portuguese? So the video was actually translated into Portuguese, and I'm looking at the screen trying to remember, now what does that say exactly? So it's kind of tricky. Let me just set it up even more, and especially if it does not play. So the two crime victims whose stories are told in this video, one is Russ Turner from Sacramento, California, and the other is Trace Bartholomew from North Carolina. And Russ Turner, his son was killed in a drunk driving case, drunk and drugged case in Sacramento. His son was like a teenager, and his son died. So he tells his story. Can you get back to the PowerPoint, Charlene?
So sorry. I'm pulling it up. Let's see. From the current side. Okay, let's see if this will share now.
If we have problems with the two videos, we'll just bypass them. You could try starting from the beginning. Now, there you go, right there.
There it goes.
Perfect.
My son was 19.
That can never happen to me.
This is Steve. He can't remember anything right now.
You know, Therese and Steve were inseparable.
Raymond 911, what is your emergency? Somebody's been shot. They're in the parking lot. They're laying on the ground. They've been shot.
Doug and I got married at the end of November, and Steve was killed in the middle of February.
23-year-old Leslie rear-ended Jeremy's car, causing it to explode early Saturday morning. Leslie was booked for murder, felony drunk driving, and felony evading officers.
There's been a movement growing in the criminal justice system. It has found its way into justice systems all around the world. It's not a program. It's driven by victims. Its impact is proven and undeniable. And yet, like all change, it is feared, dismissed sometimes as too soft on criminals, and sometimes too much in favor of crime victims.
For over 20 years, I've worked as a legislative advocate in the criminal justice system, working with both victims and offenders. Around the world, justice experts realize that the criminal justice system is broken and it's deeply flawed. It hurts both victims and offenders alike.
The current system is not set up to help people heal. That's kind of the bottom line. It's not set up to help victims find their voices. It's not about that.
I don't thank God that he's dead, but I thank God that I have some peace. A week from now I may, and as we learn more about who and what, I may feel differently.
The current system fails victims by leaving them out of the system. The way we process crime now is it's seen as a crime against the state, not against a victim, a real human being. Offenders aren't encouraged to take responsibility for their actions. Instead, we warehouse them in prison.
Offenders don't usually think about their victims, but that's not surprising because the criminal justice system doesn't lead them there. In fact, there are barriers that block that type of access. RJI is working to remove those barriers that block a crime victim's access to restorative justice.
I'm in the process of contacting all these different people about getting into the prison and how to do that correctly. At the time that I saw Carl, I had no idea that there was anything called restorative justice. I just knew that I saw humanity in this person, and I wanted to meet him.
With a criminal justice system so badly flawed that 2.2 million Americans are incarcerated in prison and jails, big questions surface. We're spending more on incarceration, but are we safer? Are crime victims satisfied? Have offenders changed once they're released?
Restorative Justice International, or RJI, calls this new vision victims-driven restorative justice. It stresses offender accountability, restoring victims and communities, but also transforming offenders, which leads to real change.
Restorative justice is not a program, but a set of principles that drives the reform of the justice system. It's a change in the system that is driven by crime victims.
It puts victims in the center of the system. Around the U.S. and globally, victims are asking for restorative justice. Evidence-based research shows it works, but victims tell us it works.
Offenders who take part in restorative justice processes are less likely to become repeat offenders. There's an emphasis on accountability, a critical component to any restorative justice process. Offenders learn what they can do to make things right from the victim's perspective.
And this is Tress Bartholomew, Cross Dayton.
I really want for you to realize how much you hurt our family. You know, your actions caused a lot of pain in our family, and I really want you to understand that.
I can understand that. Well, originally I wasn't too sure about participating in this, and then I figured it was a way to return something to your family, because I know it had to hurt a lot.
I don't know, I just feel like I have to do something. I have to do something. The things that have made me feel the best in this 9 years is what we've done, going to the schools.
Victims experience healing on some level that they don't experience through the current justice system. It's particularly critical to healing for victims after violent crime. Often, this happens through victim-offender dialogue, but sometimes it can happen through something as simple as an exchange of letters.
Dear Mr. and Mrs. Turner, I don't know if I should be writing or not. I don't want to cause you more pain. It's hard to read than I already have. I'm writing now because my mom told me she has met you, and you're good people, and you will understand if I tell you I'm sorry. I didn't know your son, but from what I heard from the video and from the videos I've seen in court, he seemed like such a good person. And it hurts inside to know his death was my fault. If I could just go back, but I can't. I have to deal with it, and I always live with the guilt. I've asked for forgiveness, but forgiveness can't make me forget what happened. What you feel is beyond what I can imagine, so I don't know what to write. Your loss was too terrible. I'm truly sorry.
For an offender to face his victim or victim's family, it's the toughest thing they'll ever do. RJI takes on tough, intractable problems that few want to touch. At RJI, and through our online discussions, we talk about how restorative justice can be applied to any kind of violent crime and any type of conflict. We're working with our affiliates as they take public positions in support of restorative justice. RJI demonstrates that restorative justice is the answer to tough-on-crime political rhetoric. It is truly comprehensive reform of the justice system. Victims are more satisfied after participating in a restorative justice process, even those impacted by violent crimes.
You know, the day that we walked out of the prison, I've never felt so empowered in my entire life. And to be able to open a door for other people to be able to go and do that is, in my mind, one of the most important things about all of this that we've done over the past several years.
It's about how to restore victims and communities, but again, how to transform offenders. This is something we're not doing, which is why our prisons are filled to capacity around the world. But we need this change. We need this new vision.
As Dr. Sandro Calvani said, at the beginning of the third millennium, restorative justice is emerging as an innovative, victims-driven healing process after a crime has injured a victim and an offender has been convicted. RJI has the great and unique value of a transparent network of scholars, justice officials, victims, and legislators who share experiences, good practices, and lessons learned in countries where restorative justice is implemented, working, and growing.
Okay, excellent, Charlene.
I'm figuring it out.
All right, that's great. Excellent. And I know that audio was a little off, but you got the feel of that. It's pretty dramatic, as I said, but I think it gives you a feel. And I know for those who are listening, especially so many that are on this call who were wrongfully convicted, I'm sure you were thinking, well, what's that have to do with our work and your lives? But at the same time, I want to walk you through this so you get a sense of what this is, and I will then talk about the connection between wrongful conviction specifically. So this just goes back with a little bit more detail about what you just heard, and just walking you through these points. So let me explain that if you've heard about restorative justice around the country and outside the country, especially Sunny, you might wonder why we call it victims driven. Well, I actually came up with that phrase, I believe. I think I'm the one who first came up with it, to kind of distinguish it from all criminal justice reform. So there are many organizations and people, entities that do restorative justice work around the country and globally. And sometimes there are some who say, in essence, say that all criminal justice reform is thus kind of thereby restorative justice. And we say, well, that's not quite accurate. We believe that unless the victim is involved, it's not restorative justice. So that's why we use the phrase. Okay, whoops. Okay, I don't know if you can read these points. Charlene, I'm not sure why that gray section is there.
Let's see.
Well, okay, I can walk you through it anyway. Yeah, it'd be better if it wasn't. Not sure why that's there.
I'm not sure. I can see the entire slide.
Okay, maybe it's just me. Can everyone else? Obi, can you actually see the screen with all the words?
No, absolutely not. I mean, like I'm also seeing that
partial.
It's like when you touch this, Charlene, it drew. It's like it just opened it up. I don't know if you can drag it to a smaller box, like you close it.
You might have to stop share and then reshare.
Yeah, maybe.
Okay, let's see.
After the video, you have to stop share.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, like the video from the spillover from the video.
Let's try this again.
So let me just say those two crime victims in the video were incredible supporters of my work. They're just two of the crime victims that we've worked with and continue to work with. And sometimes we find individuals and we seek them out and say, join us, and sometimes they find us. But a real huge blessing to work with crime victims like that. The case of Russ Turner, he did meet his offender, as you saw, inside prison. Well, actually both cases, but they started with an exchange of letters, which can be very powerful when it's allowed, as you know. Sometimes it's not allowed. There you go. Okay, actually go back to the previous slide. It should say victims driven. There you go, perfect. Okay, so here we go. Restorative justice processes must include the victim of crime or victim's family. It's not restorative justice if it excludes victims or their families. Whoop.
It popped back in.
Really?
Yeah. I just think it's that video and then recording. I think it's making it do that because the screen looks like, there it goes, gone.
Okay.
Okay, let's hopefully it stays there. Yeah, it shouldn't be the video, but anyway, okay. So the second is, ideally, restorative justice is initiated by the crime victim. So that's ideally. We support that process in that way, having the victim initiate it, because without the victim, you have no victim-offender dialogue. And often it's without their support, it's just not going to go forward. So we've had people come to us and say, well, can the offender initiate a restorative justice dialogue? They can, but it's a little more difficult. But we don't think that that's a bad thing. We just think it's better to come from the crime victim. And number three, offender accountability is key, and that was mentioned in the video. That the importance of the offender actually taking responsibility for his actions after crime. And four, offender recidivism rates are lower and victim satisfaction rates are higher after its use. This is really critical. We do a lot of work around evidence-based research, and since public policy needs to be supported by research, we strongly support good research being done where there's tracking of restorative justice when programs are used nationally and internationally. And the evidence is there. People say, well, what kind of evidence is there for this stuff? There's a lot. We have many citations on our site under news and other places. So look around our site if you're interested. But there's some really exciting studies that have come out in the UK and just all over Australia, many places, but where it shows that the crime rates go down, recidivism rates go down, and then victim satisfaction rates go up. And often when evidence-based research is conducted on crime and on crime rates, victim satisfaction rates aren't considered at all, which we think is a big mistake. We think you have to add that into the equation. And lastly, kind of the same point, success rates are based on satisfaction of the victim or victim's family. So obviously not always the direct victim, because if it's a victim of murder, it would be the family. Okay, next slide. Okay, and these are main tenets. Now these are kind of, this is kind of like a primer on restorative justice, but this is taken from a couple sources. This is kind of seen as the yardstick of restorative justice. You know, what is it? What does it really mean? And both of the sources that I'm citing are two very well-known individuals. Howard Zare, Eastern Mennonite University, he's retired, but he's considered he's considered the grandfather of restorative justice, and he's very well respected. Many books he's written on the topic of restorative justice. And then there's another individual who I've worked with, Dan Van Ness, of Prison Fellowship International, and he's called the father. And I actually worked closely with Dan and worked with Prison Fellowship International. So these are points that are often made. So number one, restorative justice recognizes that crime is a violation of people and relationships. Number two, that it recognizes that such a violation creates an obligation to make things right. That's a phrase we use quite a bit in our work, making things right. That's important. And number three, it requires a process that maximizes the exchange of information between the offender and the victim, and potentially the families of both. And number four, it empowers victims in ways that promote healing while transforming the lives of offenders who participate. Okay, next slide. Okay, these are guidelines for restorative justice. So just a little bit more meat on the bones. Restorative justice processes are more likely to involve the victim, offender, and the community as meaningful participants than to limit participation to the government as the sole active party. So in the video, it kind of makes the point of often crime is seen as crime against the state, where the state is the victim. And we say, no, that's not accurate. There is a real victim, and the victim needs to be involved, and then communities are injured as well after crime. Number two, restorative justice processes are more likely to hold offenders accountable for their actions by stressing reparation to the victim. So restitution, some kind of reparation, and to make things right with the victim. Number three, restorative justice processes are more likely to emphasize the responsibilities of the offender to make things right. And number four, restorative justice processes are more likely to be considered complete when victims and offenders are reintegrated into their communities rather than when legal obligations alone are met. So obviously this is critical. It's critical for both the offender when they come back into the community after prison or jail, but also we make the point that victims after crime, they have to be reintegrated as well, and people forget that because violent crime is so traumatic to victims and their families. Okay, next slide. Now these are just some examples of restorative justice. So the first one is what was mentioned in the video. This is probably the most commonly understood example of restorative justice is victim-offender dialogue. So when the victim and the offender get together, when they meet, and usually that's with a trained facilitator, not a mediator, but a facilitator. But that's probably the most common understanding of what restorative justice is, which isn't totally correct. Number two, family group conferencing and circles. So that would be when the victim and the offender meet in a group setting, and that would involve usually the family, the rest of the family, some family members, both with the victim and the offender. And that's also considered around the country, and probably even more so, as something called circles, restorative justice circles. Number three, in-prison restorative justice programs. That's something that Obi actually mentioned at the start that I've been involved in. In fact, I'll talk about this in more detail, but we're a strong supporter of in-prison restorative justice programs using crime victims. So victims going into the prison meeting with offenders. Number 4, community service. You know a lot about that, I'm sure. The idea of doing the sentence in the community where in essence you pay back the community or the victim. That's most ideal, but as a way of showing restorative justice. And we think community service is kind of it's a reflection of restorative justice, but it's better when the offender actually pays back a victim. So an example would be, let's say graffiti was painted on a wall of a business. Instead of the community having to paint out that graffiti and make that community safer again, if it's gang graffiti, then it would be better for the offender to be sentenced to actually getting rid of the graffiti himself and actually even meeting the business owner. That would be ideal. Number 5, victim impact statements. You've all heard about that. Victims actually going into court and talking about the impact the crime has had on their lives and on their families. This is something that's very important in the United States, but it's actually important around the world. But we always say that's just the beginning. The fact that the victim gets up and talks about the impact the crime has had on him or herself, that's the beginning. So it's just an example of restorative justice, but not a complete one, but it's important nonetheless. Number 6, restitution, where the victim is paid restitution by the offender ideally and not from just a fund. So we think that when an offender is sentenced and includes restitution, it's best for those monies to go directly to the victim when possible, and we've supported legislation on that. And we have to make the comment that when an offender does not have the ability to pay restitution easily because of lack of funds, a lack of job, then often what is best is that there's a victim offender agreement that's negotiated between the victim and the offender so that that offender could pay over time. And that might be over a long period of time based on that person's ability to pay. But anyway, it should be negotiated. Number 7, drug courts, where if the offender is drug addicted, that individual needs drug treatment, and that needs to be taken into consideration. Restorative justice can play a part there, but I think it can. This is where the victims can also be supportive of understanding if the offender is addicted, that he needs treatment. And lastly, citizen accountability boards, and that's just getting citizens more involved in the justice process in their own communities, and hopefully supporting restorative justice options and not just prison or jail. Okay, next slide. Okay. And Charlene, we have one more video, but I think we got 2 more slides to go.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is actually a really near and dear to my heart, this project here. I just told Obi and Charlene last week actually a little bit about this project. So Sycamore Tree Project, let me set it up. So in 1998, I was very much honored to be chosen to direct one of the first intensive in-prison restorative justice programs in the country, and actually at the time in the world. So it was in 1998, it was in the state of Texas. It was in a medium security prison outside of Houston, Texas. And the project was whoops, we're losing the screen there. Okay, there we go. The project was a program of Prison Fellowship International. I was a consultant to them at the time, and Prison Fellowship International was also founded by Chuck Colson, but their work is international. And I was part of a team that was working on restorative justice, and I was working for Dan Van Ness, who I mentioned earlier. So Dan was the creator of this project, and it brought victims and offenders together in prison. So it was small groups of victims and offenders. It ran over 8 weeks. The program has also been 8 to 10 weeks, sometimes 12 weeks. And trained facilitators were trained by me. They were volunteers. And the purpose of the project was to bring restorative justice into the prison. And it was a test, so we were piloting the program. And it really was to expose offenders in prison to the effects of crime on victims. And it was to many of us who were involved, we understood that often offenders don't think about their victims directly because, like I said, the system doesn't lead them there. The offenders in this project were, almost all of them were offenders who had committed a violent offense. The victims that were in the program were all victims of violent crime. And as I told Obi, about this project, when I was asked to do it, I actually first said, "You got the wrong person." And I said that because I had a public policy background. I'd been a lobbyist, I'd been a staffer in the legislature, and I told Dan Van Ness, "It ain't me, you got the wrong person. I have no idea how this would work in a prison. I've never done it." He said, "Yeah, I know." And his response was, "Well, you have the heart for it." And I kind of thought, oh, well, that might be true. But I really resisted it. And then when I looked at the curriculum was, huge, this big thing. And I thought, I'm looking at it thinking, how is this going to work? And I also thought, well, what's the good of victims and offenders meeting if they're not related? So I didn't point that out. So these were surrogates. These were real victims and real offenders, but unrelated cases. And when I first looked at the document, I thought, I don't get it. Why would we put people together? What's the value of that? And so I was skeptical. But as we started, we had to get the buy-in from the state of Texas, which was no small deal. As you know, the state of Texas executes a lot of people. And I kind of thought, why are we going into Texas? But there was support, and the Department of Corrections was willing. And it had a lot to do with the founder, Chuck Colson, and Prison Fellowship, and how active they were around the country. So Prison Fellowship Ministries is active in every prison in the country. At one time, they were probably more active than they are now due to COVID, but other things as well. But they had a lot of credibility. But the victims that I was given that were going to be part of this project, they were very active, to be honest. They were active in the state of Texas. They were active in the city of Houston, and they were active in a way that I thought didn't necessarily reflect restorative justice. Okay, so I'm looking at this thinking, well, is this going to be a success? And I concluded that it was either going to be a great success or it would be a bomb. So it was a great success. So these topics you're looking at now are the 8 weeks. So this is, like I said, one model. There have been other models that were used. So the victims and offenders would meet in small groups with a trained facilitator. And the first topic was just introducing what is crime. And during that session also we talked about domestic violence because many of the offenders had been guilty as such. And we talked about domestic violence. The second week was victim stories. So victims of violent crime that were unrelated to this project came in, and they met with both the victims and the offenders and all the staff, including guards, by the way. I was there. I wasn't at all the sessions, but I was at this session. And, we had a presentation where they told their stories. And it was really a way to open up the project. It really got everybody in a place to proceed because they were gut-wrenching stories. I can't say that all the victims had experienced healing in their own life, but yet telling their stories was very cathartic for them, but it was also, it planted a seed, I think, in the lives of the participants as they moved through this project. So number 3 was accountability, and these are just discussions around accountability and all these other subjects. And by the way, what I didn't say is this project was considered a faith-based project. We used scripture, and it was not open only to people of faith. We're very clear about that anyone could participate, both victims and offenders, regardless of their faith or lack of it, or if they were a part of another religion, let's say. Number 4 was confession. So these subjects, as you can probably realize, they were difficult. We're talking about confession, so that's a tough one, obviously, for a lot of reasons. But it was talked about, and in these small groups, and there would be various ways of bringing out conversations about these topics. So I'll just move on. So number 5, repentance, importance of repentance for an offender, and important for the victim to hear. Number 6, a difficult subject for victims in particular, forgiveness. And so this curriculum, like I said, it was a test, and I was very involved in the writing of it, not the original writing, but actually after the project was over, editing it. And but it was difficult. We got feedback throughout the project, and it was difficult because forgiveness is difficult to talk about, but it also can be very forgiving, very healing for both the victim and the offender. And 7, we talked about restitution, the importance of restitution to a victim, or a type of restitution where if it's not financial, there are other ways that an offender can pay restitution that's meaningful to the victim. And often, like I said, with restorative justice, there's often some kind of written agreement that occurs where the victim talks to the offender about what is important for them to get from the offender through a restorative justice process. And the last week was reconciliation, and reconciliation doesn't always happen, but we talked about that as the kind of the pinnacle what could happen between a victim and an offender through restorative justice. That's not the goal necessarily, but reconciliation is a beautiful thing if it can occur. But that was the close of the project. And as I told Obi and Charlene, this often was at the very end of the project, and participants would give their own testimony about this project and what it meant to them. And there wasn't a dry eye in the house, let me say that. So I remember the end of this project was occurred in the chapel in the prison there in Sugar Land, Texas. So this was a great success, and Sycamore Tree then was replicated in the UK and in New Zealand shortly thereafter. It's now still occurring around the world, and I believe in 40 countries. And let me tell you this story. One of the victim participants in the project is named John Sage. He's in the state of Texas. His sister was brutally murdered, and he was one of my participants. And when he came in, I remember he told me later that he wasn't sure what he was doing there, but he felt an urge to participate. And I remember he told me that after the death of his murder of his sister, he wanted the death penalty. And he changed his mind over the years about the death penalty. I'm not sure it was due to this project, but what was amazing about it is that after this project was over, it had a huge impact on his life, and he started his own organization called Bridges to Life. And you can find that group online, Bridges to Life, and they've been a similar program since probably 1999 all over Texas, and some national replications, and then he's done a lot of work or consulting around the world. So it's incredible, and it really changed my work, how I see this work, especially as somebody who has a legislative background. I saw how restorative justice could be applied in prison, and it was my feeling after directing this project that it should be occurring around the country, in every prison and around the world. Now, it didn't happen, by the way. I tried to actually get it in California. I can make that point. I'll just say where. I tried to get it in Mule Creek Prison, and we spent a lot of time knocking on that door. They were interested. They also said, you fund it. And I thought, well, we couldn't fund it easily at that hour. I had a nonprofit at the time, the Justice and Reconciliation Project, but they were willing to do it, but they said, we have no money for you. And it was difficult to raise money around it. So that's a shame, but here it is 2020 and we still need it. So next slide. And I'll take questions on all of this at the end. We can go back. and it should be working with crime victims.
For some reason, it's not moving. Oh, there it goes.
There we go. They're perfect. Okay, so these are kind of obvious, but some people do, even in the restorative justice field. I guess what I have found over the years is not everyone works with crime victims. I guess they sometimes don't understand how to, and they don't understand how to reach out to victims of violent crime. So we say these are some of the ways that you break that ice, and you listen. That's the obvious one, and crime victims have a story to tell. And that's the biggest question you could ask is, what happened? Tell us your story. And in fact, we do a lot of podcasts. I plan to do one with Obi. That'll happen, we hope, in the next probably 30 days. But we have podcasts on our site. I think we're at number 34. So we interview crime victims, ex-offenders, and others. But you have to ask, what's your story? And number 2, showing respect to the victims, which is obvious that it's something you need to do, and respect where they're coming from, the pain that they've endured. Number 3, you involve them in the process, just reaching out to crime victims that are active, even those whom you might disagree with. I've done quite a bit of that. I've learned a lot by working with victims of violent crime who don't necessarily agree with all that we do, but you can find a way of building relationships with people, even if they don't fully support everything that you support, and especially with RJI. Let me just make a point about that. We work with an organization called Journey of Hope. And in fact, Sunny, I believe, is very involved in that organization. That might be where I've heard of her and knew of her. So Bill Pilkey, who's the founder of Journey of Hope, From Violence to Healing, is a great friend of mine. I sat on his board at one time. He sat on the board of my first nonprofit, and also RJI. But Journey of Hope is a group of crime victims that it's national and also global, and they do not support the death penalty. And I remember when I met Bill Pilkey, he's out of Alaska, we connected. I think I saw him online, and I thought, wow, I wanted to learn more. And I had learned about Bill Pilkey and how his grandmother was brutally murdered in Indiana, and how he came through a period of rage and really wanted the death penalty, came out the other end and saw the light. And it really was a faith experience in his life. But he also realized later that restorative justice interconnected with the death penalty. And there are crime victims who don't support it, and we reach out to them. So number 4, ask questions. And one point I want to make about this, RJI, from a public policy standpoint, we support a victim's right to restorative justice. We think that should be in our statutes. We think it should be something that restorative justice should be offered by the DA to the crime victim. And number 5, offer assistance to victims after a crime. That's very important because often they have needs that go unserved. And lastly, you working with crime victims organizations. And when I was lobbying in California for Justice Fellowship, there were many victims of violent crime that were organized.
And Jeremy, you guys, have you?
Okay, I'll just go on. Whoops. Little interference there, Obi. I'm not sure.
I don't know who that is. Excuse me, Lisa. But if everyone that's on a participant, if you could please your mics while she presents. Thank you.
Okay, so what I was just making the point was when I lobbied in California for Justice Fellowship, yeah, we're still getting that.
Exit ticket is submitted. It does it. They'll still do it. Sometimes they won't. They'll send it to us.
Should I just go ahead?
Yeah.
Sounds like a phone call.
Oh, no.
The importance of working with victims organizations. So in California, when I was lobbying in the 90s, so we did a lot legislatively. We had a community corrections bill that we authored, the importance of having alternatives to incarceration for nonviolent offenders in particular. We authored a bill, and on that, and Senator Bill Lockyer, and those of you in California would know him. He was the majority leader at the time. He was the author of the bill. I actually worked for Bill Lockyer a long time ago, and not a great position, but I was on the staff nonetheless. And I came to Senator Lockyer and asked him to carry this bill, the Community Corrections Bill, and it was co-authored by a Republican, Senator Tim Leslie. But that bill was to bring restorative justice into the system to allow it to be in the structure inside the correctional system in California. Now, there were victims groups that were very active in the Capitol at the time. They still are. And what I realized that those victims didn't know what restorative justice was. If they thought they knew, we felt that they might have got almost misinformation about it. So it's important to work with victims group and try to get them on your side. But also what I learned was that it was very powerful to have victims talk about their support of restorative justice. And so that's why we organize victims around the country and globally. Okay, next slide. That might be the video, Charlene. Okay, let me set this one up before you run it. There you go. Hopefully it'll open. So let me set this up. This is a short video, another real short one. I think it's one of the best in the world. And from the perspective of the offender, it's called Why Me? Well, I'm sorry, it's called The Wolf Within. And the video was created by a group called Why Me? So Why Me ? And they're in the UK. And this is the story of Peter Wolf and Will Riley. Okay, Charlene.
I couldn't really even begin to tell you how many crimes I've committed. I was once described as a walking crime wave. I was quite chuffed by that. I've always drunk. I used to love a drink, even as a kid. It was a way of life. I started taking drugs when I was 10. So all of a sudden I looked round and I was sticking needles in myself. I was an heroin addict. I'd stayed in a squat over East London, which I'll describe it to you. It was human waste all over the floor, syringes and empty beer cans everywhere, blood squirted up the wall from the syringes. My bed was an old mattress that we'd found in the dustbin, and my blankets were the clothes I slept in. I stunk to high heaven. That's how I lived. All this time I was taking other drugs, drinking copious amounts of alcohol, committing crime on a daily basis, sometimes on a multi-daily basis, 10 times a day crimes. It depended on how much you earn.
It's about 5 o'clock. I'm in my office, which is in the first floor, and it's time to go to the gym. I go upstairs, and as I walk up to the top landing, I push open the door, and there's a man I'd never seen before.
He says, "What are you doing?" This is my house. "What are you doing in here?" And I'll give him some old flannel. I said, "Oh, I live over the road at number 2, and I see someone acting suspiciously, and I heard a funny noise."
And I said, "Where's number 2?
I said, "Over there." But unfortunately, it was over there. And so he knew I was telling lies, and he knew I was a burglar.
He unfortunately ran into a kitchenette that we have on the top floor and shouted "knife." And so I thought, oh, God, now we're in real trouble.
And I had this guy after me, and I didn't get a knife. I got the top of the oven, heavy old thing, cast iron, and I put it, smashed him over the head behind me.
Which hurt, but again, I'm pumping, so I don't feel it very much.
He stumbled and we fought, and as we fought, we rolled down a flight of stairs, proper John Wayne stuff going on there, and there was a big old flower pot, and I picked it up and smashed him straight over the head with that. And I remember the blood coming out of his head.
And I kept going, and we bundled and fought, and I got him outside the door, and I said, help me. And it just looked like 2 middle-aged men having a ding-dong. And then the police car came, so obviously someone had called the police.
The police pull up, and I'm nicked in the back of the van.
They said to me, are you okay? And I said, yeah, I'm fine. And I said, well, you're bleeding. And as I put my hand behind my head, I've got my whole head is just saturated in blood.
I'm not about to sit there feeling remorseful and sorry. It was just a bad day at the office for me, so I'm off to prison, and oh well, can't wait to get to prison, because get to prison, that means I can get some drugs.
My wife came to collect me in the hospital, and as I put the key in the door, I suddenly had a fear that there would be somebody at the other side of the door. And it happened day after day after day after day. And it's not a very nice feeling. You feel scared. So about 2 or 3 weeks later, a police officer called me, and he said that we're conducting a study on a thing called restorative justice, where the offender meets the victim. Would you be interested in taking part?
If I'm honest, part of me sort of wanted to say sorry to this fella, but the majority of me only wanted to do the restorative justice conference to get out of the cell for an hour. Suddenly this day came, and the prison officer opened my door. It was a lunchtime, and he said, "Come on then." I'm walking along this passageway. Whether or not it's true, I don't know, but apparently the screws used to say this was where the condemned man used to go. And at that very moment, I started to feel like a condemned man. I'm thinking, I don't really want to do this. I don't want to go and meet the victims of my crimes. I don't want to meet anyone. I just want to go and lay in my bed. And we get up to the door, and I'm thinking, I don't want to be here. I just don't want to be here. Just as I went to say it, the door opened.
And there is a guy I fought about 2 months earlier, and he's in a sort of prison garb and looking really sheepish. And, I'm beginning to think, what the hell are we doing here? But anyway, it's going to happen. Whatever it is, it's going to happen. So here we go.
So I started going on about the poor old me's and how I've had an hard life, and giving all the social spiel, because all my life that's what I've done, give social spiel to probation officers and social workers. I thought I had everyone eating out the palm of my hands.
He's just going through the movements, just going through the same old lines, the same old tripe. And I'm beginning to get very, very annoyed, very, very annoyed.
And it came to a point, and I said to
Will, when we first met. And that's it. And I just lose it completely.
And he started listing all the things that I've done. And he also started listing his feelings.
And it comes out like a fire hydrant. And I said to him, we didn't meet at some bloody cocktail bar in Islington. You broke into my house. You destroyed my one belief that I had, which is my ability to protect my family, my house, from people like you, and you did it in one fell swoop.
I never knew it made people feel sad, angry, bad, depressed, isolated, guilty about things I'd done. Yeah, I didn't know.
Peter was just, it was like a train hitting him. You could see that he God, I've done this.
It was like a flow of emotion started coming out, and I never realised it. I just never realised the damage I'd done. I never realised the harms I'd caused. I never realised how many people it affected.
And he was a man who wasn't showing remorse because the lawyer had said, you got to show remorse to get time off. He was a man who was genuinely affected by what we had said. And we start conversing, we start talking, and Peter starts talking. He starts talking from his heart, from his real core of his existence.
When you hear the damage, what you have done, when you hear the harm you've caused, you've got to be a very, very bitter and twisted human being if this doesn't affect you. You've got to be a sicko. I was fully expecting these people who I'd done a lot of harm to say, lock him up, give him the birch, throw away the key, we don't care. But I was quite amazed. So I went back to that cell and sat there with all these feelings, and I sat with them for a long time trying to work them out and separate them. And
you can't just leave him there. You've got to help him help himself. So therefore, we then went out and said, listen, we want to see you change. We want to see you get yourself together. We want to help you in this process.
We'd like to see him address his alcohol and addiction problems. We'd like to see him address his offending problems. We'd like to see him maybe get some education, and we'd like to see him even get a job when he gets out.
In a court of law, the victim sits in the public gallery. he, she, his family, his loved ones are the most affected by this crime and then the least involved in the process.
They don't get no input into it, and there's questions that need answering, and they can't possibly answer these questions unless they meet the harmer, the wrongdoer, the villain of the piece, the criminal.
And that's all this is bringing people around, well, it happened to be a prison table, but I mean, it could be anywhere, and having them saying, well, why did you do that? You know, do you understand how that affected me? Do you understand how that affects other people? Ever since we first met, we continue to meet. We have become, both of us, utter converts to restorative justice, to restorative approaches, to bringing offenders and victims together.
Because of that conference, it initiated change, it implemented change. I implemented the change, but it sort of gave me the kickstart I needed. You know, I can't express gratitude enough for the Restorative Justice Program, and I've got to leave it there for a minute.
Great, thank you so much. Go ahead and go to the next slide. We just have 2 more and then we'll transition. It should say the importance of offender accountability.
I think I have to stop and reshare again.
Okay, so let me just say that I reached out to Peter Wolf, and I'm not even sure how that happened, but we do this work internationally, and we've had a number of calls, and there's a podcast that you can find with Peter on our site, RGI Podcasts. I call him a friend, and he is that. He's in the UK, he still remains crime-free, and he does consulting work, especially with those who are addicted, and he continues to be a great advocate for restorative justice. He's got a lot of health issues, so we're grateful he's still with us. But that film, The Wolf Within, is available, and you can go through us or through Why Me in the UK. Okay, so these are kind of some obvious ones. Offender accountability, the importance to crime victims. It kind of just sums it up, what you just saw in that video. Direct offender accountability is best, taking personal responsibility, making things right with the victim and the community. And it's important for victims that they know what the future intention of the offender is. They're concerned about being re-victimized. That's why restorative justice is so important, because it takes away the fear. And lastly, they want their offender to stay crime-free. Okay, next. Okay, this is just a picture of me with 3 victims, and they all support restorative justice. Let me just mention the individual on the far left is an incredible story. And again, he came to us. He's from Wyoming. He was a state trooper in Wyoming, and he was pursuing a bank robber on a rural highway way out in the boonies in Wyoming. His name is Stephen Watt. And when he tried to apprehend the bank robber shot him in the face, took out his eye, and then shot him 7 times through his body, through his back, and he was left bleeding to death out in the middle of nowhere. And the story was unbelievable. When I got the message, either a letter or an email, I actually couldn't believe it. I thought, what happened? And what transpired afterwards is that he was filled with rage after this crime. He lost his ability to be a police officer because of his disabilities, and he had so many injuries and surgeries that he really couldn't move on. And but he came to a place where he realized he needed to meet the offender. So he made that happen. He went into prison in Wyoming and he met the man who shot him. And through that experience and his own reckoning with what happened, he forgave the man. His name is Mark, and he's seen him repeatedly over the years and actually wanted the state of Wyoming to free him, and the state still has not freed him. And by the way, Steve Watt became a state legislator in Wyoming. He's no longer serving, but we're glad that he was there. And anyway, it's an incredible story, a real miracle. And there's Russ Turner, and then the person on the right is Jean Bishop, whose sister, unborn child, and brother-in-law were murdered outside of Chicago. And Jean has been very active with the organization Journey of Hope and other organizations. She and her family opposed the death penalty from the start, and the offender remains in prison to this day. Okay, and the next slide. Actually, I'll just, I'm missing one slide, just some of the places around the world where restorative justice is particularly prominent. The UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Rwanda, Brazil, India, Ireland, and there are many more. I actually want to go to some points about wrongful conviction. And I don't have a slide on this, so I'm just going to walk you through it, and then I'll take your questions. So let me just make some points. I spoke in Davis, California a year ago, where I once lived, and I was at a conference sponsored by the Davis Vanguard. You might have heard of that, especially if you're from California. They have an entity called Court Watch. But we partner with the Davis Vanguard, and that event that I spoke at with others was on prosecutorial conduct. And I made a presentation that's similar to what I'm going to say right now. And we talk about why restorative justice and wrongful convictions are so important. So what is the connection? Well, number one, victims would never want the wrong person in prison for a crime he didn't commit. By convicting the wrong person, the real offender is not arrested, but left free to commit another crime. Number two, systemic reform of our broken justice system must address all injustices, including wrongful convictions. Number three, district attorneys are the first stop for crime victims once they've entered the system, after they or their loved one has been a victim of crime. So DAs need to support restorative justice fully, and we believe they should offer it to victims. When that's not possible due to lack of services, district attorneys should support the creation of such services along with seeking funding to fund these services. And we think that should be in our laws. And lastly, those who are wrongfully convicted deserve restitution once they're exonerated. That's a reflection of restorative justice principles, and we consider those who've been wrongfully convicted as victims of the justice system. So we believe they deserve restitution as any crime victim does, and which we support. Number five, prosecutors and any justice official who knowingly contributes to the conviction of an innocent person should be held accountable under the law. And that is applying restorative justice, using that language about offender accountability to the problem of wrongful convictions. And then lastly, just tell a story about an individual that I met, and this was prior to meeting Jeff Deskovic. I've had an interest in wrongful convictions for a long time. I was active with an organization called Freedom Foundation, which was founded by an offender who was not innocent in San Quentin. His name was Dennis Jones, and I met him many years ago. And he founded a group that was similar to other organizations that free the wrongfully convicted. But I met a man named Greg Wilhoit, and Greg was on Oklahoma's death row. He was innocent. He was convicted of killing his wife, and the only evidence that was used against Greg was that supposedly teeth marks were found on his wife's back. So he was convicted only on that evidence, supposed evidence. He was freed, and the murderer was never found. And Greg was convicted of killing his own wife, and the murderer was never found. Greg died in 2014 in Sacramento, and he never received a cent from the state of Oklahoma, which we think is wrong. I met Greg in person, and we became friends because he lived in Sacramento, but I met him through the organization Journey of Hope. And so lastly, RJI is committed to applying restorative justice to wrongful convictions, and I want to say that we must be vigilant and expansive as we seek to apply restorative justice to wrongful convictions nationally and globally. So that's the end of my formal presentation, Obi, and I'll take any questions.
Well, I definitely appreciate that. That presentation is really, definitely really informative. I think for us, and again, like I said from the onset of the convening, is that the reason why I reached out and the reason why I reached out and had asked Lisa if she could come to do this presentation with us, realizing and understanding that the bulk majority of us have been participants in some form of restorative justice, whether it was through the Innocent Projects, where we had an opportunity to gather with Sujata and other individuals who do the restorative justice in that aspect, and also because based on that conversation that we had there at that restorative justice about having this same action happen that happens with crime victims and victims of crime and individuals who committed the crime, for that same type of thing to happen when it comes to prosecutors and also defense attorneys and also jurors and judges. I've been since then been furthering that conversation not only with the judicial justice community, having conversations with them about their active role in the courtroom, but also what does that look like in respect to restorative justice, giving us exonerated individuals opportunity, in other words, to venture off into that restorative space when it comes to them. Reason being, understanding that that jurors, specifically looking at that form, didn't know that they were being involved in this wrongful process, but nevertheless have been affected by what has transpired because they was involved with someone who was framed and put in prison for X amount of years, and that sits on them. And so they also want to be able to share and tell their stories in this space right here, and specifically, particularly because I was really thrilled and interested in the work that she was doing, like I said in the beginning, in regards to Maurice Caldwell and advocating for him at the Victims' Compensation Board. And I thought it was really interesting, and if you can, talk just a little bit about the language that you guys are utilizing in regards to compensation versus utilizing the word compensation or restitution, but approaching it in a different manner. I think that for me and for us, that understanding the power in words and language and how wording things differently and approaching it in a different manner based upon that wording can create a different outcome. So if you can talk to us a little bit about that right there.
Yeah, very good. So let me just tell you about the story of Maurice Caldwell, because I know you all know him well. And I met him actually in Davis when I was speaking at that event last year about prosecutorial conduct. And I knew about the Victims' Compensation Fund in California because of my work there, and almost all my career was in California. But I was aware of the fund, and I didn't know how routinely they reject those who are innocent as those who should receive compensation. And when I heard that Maurice had been denied by the Victims' Compensation Board, I thought, well, that's just not right. That's not right. And when David Greenwald of the Davis Vanguard and I did a joint podcast with Maurice, which you can find on our site, we talk about that because he was being represented by the Innocence Project. And so you know, when we run into barriers where justice is not served for people that are exonerated like yourselves, we need to change the law. I mean, it's just that simple. And I know that OB and your organization OB, that's exactly what you're doing. You know, we can do all the kind of lobbying that we do, you know, kind of in the public domain, you know, the public sphere, and try to change public opinion. But at the same time, we have to change the laws. And if a compensation board in any state or any country denies innocent people compensation, then we just think we need to change that. And if that means getting certain people off the board or getting to the governor who appoints them and get the right people on there, you know, it's not, like you said it, and as we use the language, it's not about compensation, it's about restitution, because we need to consider those who are innocent as victims of violent crime. When I worked with Jeff Deskovic and the podcast I did with him and just the relationship I had with him, you know, we create two victims. Both the original victim does not get justice, but then obviously the person that's in prison for a crime he did not commit, he's a victim. And that's exactly what the justice system has to acknowledge. And they have to acknowledge it through statute. So that's critical, and we back it. And in Maurice's case, I told Maurice, we're there for you. We will sign a letter in support of you getting this kind of compensation. And we're aware that San Francisco District Attorney Chesa Bodine has some say in this at this hour, because that's the county where Maurice was convicted. And just a sidebar comment, in the last year or two, I guess it's 2 years, we have been getting more involved politically. We're actually not a nonprofit, we're a .com, so we're considered a business, but we have sought out candidates who are running for district attorney, and we have taken positions to whether to support or not support a candidacy, a district attorney who's running for re-election. And we endorsed Chesa Bodine, for instance. That was our first endorsement. Why? Because he supported restorative justice, and he supported systemic change in the system, and he had a platform on wrongful convictions. So there are others that we've endorsed nationally.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And I definitely want to open it up to the floor, to the rest of the individuals that's here on the Zoom, in other words, for any questions, in other words, that you may have of Lisa, asked of myself. And then also, before we get off, because I see that we have, you know, the miracle of innocence. We also have some writers is on here, and then also some new individuals in chat. Troy, definitely want you to have an opportunity to introduce yourself, because we have new faces. We have Jenna Dixon here, who's new but not new, but she's definitely new home after being 40 years in prison for something that she shouldn't have been in there. 44 years. I mean, like, and so I really love that lady right there. She's been an inspiration to me, and her just strength and stability, in other words, to do what she's doing now. And, you know, really appreciate the fact that you sat in on for this specific one, because we're talking about restorative justice. And for you specifically, there's so many different layers that are involved that applies to you on both and in both spheres. And so I really appreciate you taking the time out today, Janet, and sitting in for this restorative justice convening. And Ziva, definitely, as always, lovely to see your face. But please, if anyone that has any possible questions, please now's the time, in other words, to ask.
And Obi, if you don't get them, I'll add a little more to my comments.